There is a quiet pain that walks hand in hand with brilliance, a burden known only to the minds that soar too high to be heard and too deep to be followed. There is a quiet divide that grows between brilliance and the world around it, an invisible but undeniable barrier. It is not built from arrogance or aloofness, but from the sheer weight of understanding. To be brilliant is to see what others do not, to feel what others numb, and to wrestle with truths too heavy for the common conversation. That burden does not manifest with fireworks or flare. It settles slowly, like dust on the shoulders of the gifted, until they realize the rooms they walk into often feel smaller than the thoughts they carry. Brilliance, true brilliance, disorients the ordinary. It speaks in a language that few understand, and it often finds itself answering questions no one else dares to ask. This distance is not deliberate. The intelligent do not seek separation, but separation finds them. Imagine a soul that perceives the unseen patterns in human nature, hears the tremble in a lie, and reads the fear beneath a smile. Such a soul cannot unsee. Their minds become a theater of internal dialogues, dissecting, analyzing, imagining. And while others laugh at surface jokes, the brilliant mind wanders off into the subtext, into the metaphor, into the meaning. It is not that they do not want connection, it is that connection requires resonance. And when the frequency of thought is rare, resonance becomes a lonely melody. Conversations feel shallow. Small talk tastes like dust. The weather, the weekend, the latest gossip, it all becomes noise, empty of nourishment. People misunderstand this as arrogance. They say the brilliant think they're better, when in truth they often feel burdened by their own sensitivity and perception. They feel like misfits in a world that worships ease over depth, compliance over questioning. They are not trying to rise above others. They are just unable to sink into what no longer feeds them. Their isolation is not a dismissal of others. It's often a defense against the overwhelm, because brilliance feels everything more. Ideas flood them. Injustice cuts them deeper. Beauty moves them longer. And when you carry the full weight of the world's contradictions, you learn to walk a little slower, a little farther from the crowd, not because you want to, but because you must. Even in relationships, brilliance can become a chasm. The need for deep conversation, for authentic inquiry, for truth unfiltered, these are not luxuries for the intelligent, they are necessities. But the world is often uncomfortable with depth. People want agreement, not challenge. They want to be seen, but not dissected. They want closeness, but not the kind that requires them to undress their soul. So the brilliant often learn to quiet their questions, to hide their insights, to dim their light just enough to keep company. But even then, they feel the ache of pretending, the dull throb of playing small in a world that rewards surface living. Sometimes brilliance is punished, not by hate, but by silence, by being left out, overlooked, too intense, too much. People avoid what challenges them. They retreat from what reflects their own unexamined lives. And so the intelligent are left on the margins, not because they are unworthy of connection, but because they are unwilling to betray their own vision to be accepted. That is the cost of clarity in a fog-filled world. In truth, brilliance strips life of its illusions, and most people would rather live comfortably in illusion than uncomfortably in truth. The intelligent are often the ones who break the spell, who name the elephant in the room, who question the tradition, who challenge the lie dressed as social norm. That kind of courage is lonely. That kind of truth is rarely welcomed. And so the intelligent often retreat, not into bitterness, but into observation, not into superiority, but into solitude. They become watchers, listeners, feelers, living on the edges, not because they are lesser, but because they are more. Too much for shallow waters, too deep for crowded boats. Solitude is one of the most misunderstood experiences in the human condition. It is so often mistaken for emptiness, for punishment, for the result of being unchosen or unloved. Society trains us to fear being alone, to equate stillness with loneliness, to believe that unless we are constantly surrounded by people, by voices, by validation, we are somehow lacking. But solitude is not a curse. It is not the dark void others have made it out to be. It is, in truth, a cradle, a quiet, sacred space in which the self is born again and again. It is the womb of transformation, the fertile soil where brilliance takes root, where the soul dares to grow without the noise of judgment or comparison. When one finally surrenders to it, solitude reveals itself as not a barren land, but a temple, a place where one hears their own heartbeat for the first time and realizes it has a rhythm of its own. Within solitude, there is no performance. There is no applause to earn, no role to play, no mask to maintain. There is only the mirror and the courage it takes to truly see oneself. In a world that feeds us curated images of who we should be, solitude invites us to meet who we are when the world stops watching. That is not a small or easy thing. It takes strength to sit in the silence and not reach for distraction. It takes strength to befriend the very self that has been buried beneath years of expectations, roles, identities that never truly belonged. Solitude is where the unraveling begins, not in destruction, but in revelation, the shedding of layers that no longer serve, the discarding of lies that once protected but now suffocate. In solitude, there is no hiding, but in that vulnerability, there is also unprecedented freedom. For the brilliant, the sensitive, the seekers, and the artists, solitude is not just comforting, it is necessary. It becomes the only place where thoughts can breathe without interruption, where ideas can stretch themselves out without fear of ridicule or misinterpretation. Solitude is the mother of insight, the midwife of intuition. It is the space where the subconscious whispers secrets that the noise of the world would otherwise drown out. Every great creation, whether a painting, a poem, a philosophy, or a movement, began not in a crowded room, but in the quiet corners of one's own mind. It is there, in the stillness, that vision is born. Not hurried, not demanded, but invited gently into the light. Many people run from solitude because they have been taught that to be alone is to be forgotten, but the wise know otherwise. Solitude is not where one is forgotten, it is where one remembers their power, their voice, their needs, their boundaries. It is the workshop of healing, the forge of resilience. In solitude, we return to our center. We touch the divine. We meet the inner child and the inner sage. We hear the echoes of old wounds and the quiet promises of new beginnings. We recognize what hurts, what heals, what matters, and what never did. Solitude holds space for all of it, not with judgment, but with profound stillness. And while the world often romanticizes connection, it fails to honor the balance it requires. Without solitude, connection becomes dependence. Without solitude, we lose the ability to show up to others as whole beings rather than empty vessels seeking to be filled. Solitude teaches us to be our own companion first, to soothe our own wounds, to celebrate our own victories, to be the friend we so often seek in others. It strengthens the foundation so that when connection comes, it is chosen, not craved. It is shared, not extracted. From that place, relationships become richer, more authentic, more enduring, not built on need, but on mutual wholeness. Solitude trains the heart to love without losing itself, to engage without erasing its own voice. There is an ancient unspoken truth buried beneath centuries of human behavior. Society has always feared what it cannot understand. This fear does not always wear the mask of terror or violence. More often, it cloaks itself in mockery, avoidance, silence, or forced assimilation. The unknown makes people uncomfortable, not because it poses real harm, but because it challenges the structure they've grown dependent on. Society is built on norms, on shared beliefs, rituals, roles, and behaviors that create a sense of stability. Anything or anyone that moves outside those boundaries becomes a mirror held up to that collective comfort, forcing people to question the rules they never dared to doubt. And for many, questioning feels too close to chaos. So instead of looking deeper, they retreat into rejection. They label the unfamiliar as dangerous, the complex as arrogant, the visionary as mad. This is not a mark against those who are different. It is an indictment of a society too fragile to embrace them. Those who possess uncommon intelligence, creativity, insight, or emotional depth often find themselves at the center of this fearful reaction. When someone speaks truths that cut through illusion or walks a path not marked by tradition, they often discover that the crowd does not gather to applaud. They scatter to protect their comfort, because comprehension requires effort. It requires unlearning, humility, openness, and courage, all qualities that must be cultivated. Most people, however, are content to live within the lines they've been handed, too exhausted or too afraid to redraw them. When a person lives outside of those lines, when they begin to question, innovate, or resist what is widely accepted, society does not immediately celebrate their originality. Instead, it often labels them as problematic, rebellious, or wrong. This dynamic is not limited to the past or to the extraordinary. It is everywhere, in schools, in families, in offices, in politics, in religion. Anytime a person dares to think or live differently, they risk being misunderstood, and that misunderstanding often leads to isolation, ridicule, or erasure. Fear of the unfamiliar is not always loud. It can be subtle, cloaked in polite rejection or passive avoidance. It's in the way people change the subject when depth enters the conversation. It's in the way unconventional thinkers are overlooked for promotions or misinterpreted as difficult. It's in the silent agreement to never question authority, never challenge tradition, never name the elephant in the room. It's in the way artists are called eccentric, the way the gifted are labeled antisocial, the way those who carry pain too visible on their faces are told to lighten up. And this fear, this collective instinct to dismiss what we do not grasp, is not only unfair, it is deeply damaging. It robs the world of its most vital contributors. It shames curiosity, it stifles innovation, it punishes difference not because it is harmful, but because it is too bright for eyes grown used to the dim. Those who suffer most under this dynamic are often those who feel everything more, who know things they cannot explain, who see layers others refuse to acknowledge. These individuals are often asked to shrink. They are taught to be silent in the face of ignorance, to laugh at jokes they do not find funny, to nod along with opinions they know are flawed. They are asked to simplify their speech, to tone down their expression, to hide their gifts under the veil of social normalcy. Not because they are wrong, but because society cannot comprehend their rightness without first confronting its own limits. And that confrontation is terrifying, because once you admit that someone outside the lines might be right, you also admit that the lines themselves may be flawed. That realization cracks the illusion. It threatens the entire architecture of comfort that so many people rely on. And for that reason, the unusual is not welcomed, it is feared. It is treated not as a doorway to expansion, but as a threat to control. And so the cycle continues, generation after generation, with society training its children to fear the unknown rather than to learn from it, to mock the misunderstood rather than to meet it with curiosity, to protect the old rather than explore the new. To be truly intelligent is to live in a constant state of becoming. The intelligent do not seek to stand apart. They are simply carried by an inner rhythm that does not match the world's usual tempo. Their curiosity is insatiable, their thoughts expansive, their hunger for meaning unending. They are not content with what is given. They question, they dissect, they reimagine. It is not rebellion for rebellion's sake, it is evolution. They do not reject systems and structures because they want chaos, but because those systems have become too small for their vision, too rigid for their questions. Fitting in requires stillness, a settling, a willingness to accept the way things are. But the intelligent do not settle. They stretch, they grow, they break through limitations that others accept as final. And in that constant growth, they outgrow not just places and roles, but relationships, ideologies, even identities once worn comfortably. This outgrowing is not always visible at first. It starts quietly, often with a restlessness that has no name, a subtle dissatisfaction with what others celebrate, a growing distance between their inner world and the conversations around them. While others are content with routine, the intelligent begin to feel caged by it. They look at their surroundings, not with disdain, but with a gentle grief, realizing that what once felt like home now feels like a holding cell. They crave depth where there is only repetition. They seek challenge where there is only consensus. And eventually the disconnect becomes too vast to ignore. It is not pride that separates them, it is progress. As they evolve, they find fewer places where their entire self is welcome. This outgrowing often leads to isolation, not because the intelligent wish to be alone, but because few can keep pace with their inner development. Conversations that once sparked now drain. Environments that once nurtured now numb. The world continues to rotate in familiar patterns, while the intelligent quietly orbit elsewhere, pulled by a gravitational force few can sense. It is not that they cannot return. They can, and sometimes they do, out of love or nostalgia. But it never feels the same. Like revisiting a childhood home, the walls are still there, the windows still let in light, but everything feels smaller and their soul no longer fits within its frame. Outgrowing is also painful because it often means leaving behind people who have not changed. Friends, partners, colleagues, they may not understand the distance that forms, and they may interpret it as abandonment, but it is not rejection, it is reality. Growth creates distance, and that distance can be misread. The intelligent are often accused of being aloof, disconnected, cold. In truth, they feel deeply, but their inner world demands solitude for clarity. Their love does not always express itself in proximity, but in authenticity. They cannot pretend to be smaller just to be close. They cannot dim their light just to stay in someone's shadow. They honor what was, but they follow what must be. The process of outgrowing is not linear. There are regressions, moments of doubt, times when the intelligent long to return to the comfort of fitting in. But the soul remembers. Once you've seen beyond the curtain, you cannot pretend it is still closed. Once your mind has touched higher ground, the valley below can no longer hold you. And so they keep rising, not with arrogance, but with necessity. Because the intelligent do not grow for show. They grow to survive, to stay true, to breathe in an air that feels like home. And as they rise, they often leave behind old versions of themselves, old dreams, even old ambitions. What once seemed important now feels irrelevant. What once defined them now confines them. This is the paradox of intelligence, not the acquisition of more, but the letting go of what no longer aligns. In this shedding, there is clarity. In this evolution, there is a solitude that is both aching and sacred. To be misunderstood is often treated as a flaw, as though the inability to be seen clearly by others signals some shortcoming in communication, character, or clarity. But this assumption overlooks a deeper truth. Misunderstanding is not failure. It is evidence of rarity. It is not a measure of how poorly one fits into the world, but how uniquely one was shaped to move through it. When someone does not conform to predictable behaviors, familiar patterns, or established language, society tends to misread them. It becomes easier to dismiss what is rare than to do the work of truly understanding it. The majority sees through a collective lens, shaped by shared values, norms, and expectations. Those who live beyond that framework, who speak in unfamiliar tones, think in abstract layers, or feel with uncomfortable intensity, are rarely met with instant comprehension. Instead, they are questioned, criticized, or entirely ignored, not because they lack value, but because their value exists outside the usual range of perception. Those who are rare often carry an inner language that the world hasn't yet learned to translate. Their metaphors don't align with common narratives. Their silences speak volumes, but the world has forgotten how to listen. Their presence can feel too intense, too reflective, too demanding, not because they intend to overwhelm, but because their energy disturbs the easy numbness many people have chosen as comfort. They are often told they are too much, too sensitive, too deep, too different. These labels are used not to define, but to confine, to reduce the rare into something manageable. But misunderstanding is not proof that one is wrong. It is often the opposite. It is proof that one is operating at a frequency not yet normalized. And what is uncommon always challenges the status quo. In every age, the most visionary souls were misunderstood, not because they lacked coherence, but because their truths arrived ahead of their time. The masses misunderstood the poet who refused to rhyme by tradition, the scientist who proposed invisible forces, the philosopher who questioned gods, the artist who painted dreams instead of landscapes. The fact that these individuals were ridiculed, ignored, or even persecuted was not a measure of their error, but a mirror reflecting the limits of collective understanding. Their failure to be accepted was, in fact, a quiet triumph of originality. And that same pattern repeats in smaller, quieter ways in the lives of everyday individuals who dare to think differently, to feel more deeply, to exist without apology. The pain of being misunderstood is real. It can lead to deep loneliness, to self-doubt, to a desire to shrink oneself for the sake of peace. But that pain should never be mistaken for proof of inadequacy. If anything, it is the emotional cost of integrity. When you refuse to dilute your essence just to be digestible, you will be misunderstood. When you live truthfully in a world that thrives on masks, people will project their confusion onto you. They will invent stories about who you are, not out of cruelty, but out of necessity. It is easier for them to wrap you in a label than to confront the ways in which you unsettle their understanding of the world. This misinterpretation becomes a kind of armor for the rare. Over time, they learn not to chase explanation. They stop needing others to understand every nuance, every motive, every silence. They begin to see misunderstanding not as a wall, but as a filter, one that reveals who is truly willing to meet them in their fullness. To be rare is to live with fewer mirrors. To be rare is to walk without a crowd echoing your every step. but it is not failure. It is the inevitable consequence of embodying something that cannot be replicated. Misunderstanding then becomes a quiet affirmation, a reminder that you are not here to echo the familiar, but to introduce the unknown. Isolation is often seen through a lens of lack of community, lack of companionship, lack of warmth or belonging. But that perception is shaped by a world that confuses connection with closeness and togetherness with validation. In truth, isolation is not a descent into loneliness. It is often a silent rising. It is not a sentence handed down to the different, the gifted, or the sensitive. It is a rite of passage reserved for those who dare to leave behind the familiar in search of the authentic. It is the invisible staircase that leads not to the crowd's approval, but to the soul's expansion. And though it feels barren at times, with no voices echoing your thoughts and no hands reaching back, isolation is a space where clarity is born and where one's essence is purified, sharpened, and strengthened. In isolation, the noise falls away and the self emerges, not the version shaped by society, but the raw, untouched spirit that has been waiting beneath layers of performance. The elevation that comes through isolation does not happen all at once. It reveals itself gradually, in moments of stillness, in days of quiet, in seasons where the outside world no longer offers the nourishment it once did. These are the periods when conversations start to feel shallow, when group dynamics feel like performance art, when once pleasurable things no longer bring joy. It is during these moments that one begins to withdraw, not out of bitterness, but because the soul begins to crave a different altitude. The air at sea level becomes too thick with pretense, too saturated with superficiality, and so the individual ascends, not in pride, but in necessity. They climb towards solitude like a mountain, seeking a vantage point where the landscape makes sense again. And when they arrive, they find not emptiness, but expansiveness. They find perspective, peace, and the kind of power that only grows in quiet soil. Isolation teaches what the world often refuses to. It teaches the value of one's own voice, how to hear it, how to trust it, how to follow it even when no one else understands. It teaches the art of self-sufficiency, of holding space for one's own healing, of becoming one's own sanctuary. It reveals the difference between loneliness and aloneness, showing that to be alone is not always to suffer. It is often to return to self, return to vision, return to purpose. In the absence of external influence, the internal compass becomes sharper. Choices are no longer made for applause, but from alignment. Creativity flows not from pressure, but from peace. Insight deepens. Patterns break, and somewhere along the way, the pain of isolation begins to turn into the power of elevation. Elevation also brings distance from people, from past selves, from roles that no longer fit. The higher one rises, the less crowded it becomes. This is not because elevation excludes others, but because not everyone is willing or ready to leave behind the comfort of the crowd. The elevated do not look down with arrogance, but with understanding. They remember the pull of belonging, the warmth of shared identity, the temptation of being accepted for wearing a mask. But they also know the price of that comfort. They know what it costs to betray their truth for proximity, what it feels like to dull their light so others won't squint. So they stay on the mountain, not because they are better, but because they are finally breathing. Isolation becomes the elevation that allows them to see their life, their work, their spirit without distortion. It becomes the place where they gather strength before descending again, if they choose to speak, to build, to guide, but they know now that even when surrounded, they will never be of the crowd again. Isolation has done its work. It has lifted them, stretched them, carved them into something higher. And though the summit may be quiet, it is not empty. It is full of the self, full of vision, full of the kind of clarity that only comes when you dare to leave the noise behind.